Okay, hi everyone. Thanks for coming out tonight. My name is Elena Taylor. I'm the Communications Coordinator here at Graham. And thank you for all coming to our Visionaire Series Experimental Film Panel. We've got some excellent filmmakers and our guest curators for Wealthy Presents here tonight to talk about the exhibition and their work. So let's just get right on into it then. I'm going to pass it off to Terra, who's our curator as well. She'll take it away. Thank you, Elena, and welcome everybody. Thank you so much for coming to this celebration of such an extraordinary exhibition and community gathering and a celebration of experimental filmmaking in Michigan. I'm joined today by the guest curators to the exhibition, as well as filmmakers featured in the exhibition, all Grand Rapidians. So to start from our list to my left, Nick Hartman. He is a filmmaker and a Grand Valley alumni, the former film curator at the UICA, which is how I initially, and maybe many of you too, became aware of the work that he was doing in bringing really interesting films to Grand Rapids. If you wanted to see anything interesting, you had to go to Nick's programming at UICA. And so he's now the film coordinator at Wealthy Theater. He co-curates OPN, or Open Projector Night, and the film program there. He was also our Art Prize artist this year. And he is formerly on the board of the Chiaroscuro Film Series, and is a board member for the Grand Rapids Film Society. And to his right is Spencer Everhart, brothers in arms. He's a professor of film at Grand Valley, where he was also an alumni after being the visiting professor there in 2018. He received his master's from York University, and he's the other half of the co-curate for Open Projector Night with Nick, and is the president of the Chiaroscuro International Film Series. Then to our filmmakers, like I said, both of whom are featured in the exhibition. To my right is Caroline Bell, who is a multimedia artist who creates experimental and mixed media installation and whose recent work focuses on memory, identity, and time. And last but not least, Anal Shah, who is also a professor of film at Grand Valley and a filmmaker and artist himself. And he explores identity, migration, and things lost in translation. He's had work shown worldwide and received his graduate education from Cal Arts. So welcome. And before we get into it, I just wanted to talk a little bit about how the exhibition came to be. When I first met with Nick and Chris Kocher, who's the president at Wealthy Theater, as I mentioned, I've been a fan of the programming there for a long time, and I knew that I wanted to do something, but I didn't quite know what. And initially, I was thinking, could we have a film play here in this gallery, or could we have an event in which we bring filmmakers? And after talking to Nick and Chris, it became clear that we had to do something bigger. Nick said to me at our first meeting that his goal was to make people understand you don't need to go to LA or New York to be a thriving filmmaker. Michigan has that. We have such a vibrant film community, and I thought that was such an amazing sentiment, and to hear about the community that the folks at Wealthy Theater and Grand Valley have been growing was such an important thing that's happening in our community. And so now we have an exhibition of 16 films by 16 extraordinary experimental filmmakers and artists, all of which comes from the spirit of Open Projector Night, I suppose you could say, but they had never been shown before at Open Projector Night. So it's all new in its own way. So to that end, I wanted to ask Nick and Spencer a little bit about the Open Projector Night history and your take on it and where we are now with it.
Yes. So the history of Open Projector Night, we launched this in 2012. Like I was introduced, I graduated from Grand Valley, and when I was in film school, it was really hard to get your work shown. You finish your film, and when it was completed, you would show it to your friends and family, or and then put it on YouTube, and everyone just kind of forgot about it. You know, making a film takes a lot of time, a lot of blood, sweat, and tears, and I wanted to create a space for filmmakers to come together to celebrate their work. So we've been doing this since 2012. Now 2023 has been a long time, and we do this 4 times a year, and we're now even expanding it. This past October, we just did Halloween edition as well. I'm looking to expand and start doing things for filmmakers that are making music videos to bring musicians together. There's so much talent in Michigan, and like Terra said, when we first met, that was like one of my biggest issues that I have is a lot of my peers in school were like rushing to LA, rushing to New York, rushing to Chicago. And I said, well, hold on, before you're going, because if you're leaving, then we can't build the scene. So what can we do to continue to nurture the scene and help Projector Night students? Things like that was it.
Yeah, and over the years, when we're putting these shows together and we're getting, sometimes it could be over 100 submissions per, seasonal show, we would get a decent amount of experimental work, and of an average maybe 10 to 12 film program that we would put together, we would want to have at least like 1 or 2 experimental films. I mean, we always try to provide a variety, a couple narratives, a couple documentaries, maybe a music video or 2. And we were always pretty successful doing that, as we would get the work to do it, I would say, but it was definitely in the minority. Most of the stuff we get is narrative-based or documentary, I suppose. Although I will say too that music videos are often very experimental. So there's a lot of overlap there, which is really nice. And me personally, I'm really fascinated by experimental film and really kind of passionate about it. So I was always really excited to include those in the shows that we would do. So when this came along and it was exclusively experimental work, and Nick asked me if I wanted to help out with it, and we would be going through all these entries, I was really, really excited. And the amount of work that we received to go through was stunning, and the quality of the work too was amazing. I mean, this was definitely, I don't remember how many submissions we had exactly.
We had a total of 113 submissions.
Okay, yeah.
We broke it down to 16.
Yeah, and cutting it down to a 16 film program was, especially based on the quality of the work, very difficult. I mean, there were films that we absolutely loved that we kind of had to, break our hearts about, not including. But we are like just thrilled with the films that are in it, and it really does speak to the fact that there are so many artists out there, even in Michigan or connected to Michigan, that are doing this kind of stuff, and that they are like magnificently talented.
Yeah.
Two of them are sitting right over there.
Yeah, I mean, to that end, maybe it would be useful if we defined our terms. To everyone on the panel, what is experimental film? Why is it not narrative film? What is it to you, I suppose? It might be a very subjective question.
Take it. You got it.
Alrighty, so for me, experimental film, what makes it different from traditional media or film is, I think of like science, because it really is experimental. It's anything you can really make it to, and, in my film, I use kind of this experimental, like, documentary aspects incorporated into it, and, this kind of experimental narrative at the same time. And so, it kind of really leaves the narrative film pretty open-ended, and, the audience is able to kind of like take what I say and what is in my film and make their own story in their own head, or either connect to it if, they've related to the underlying themes of my piece. And with experimental film in general, it's really just whatever you really make it to be, in my opinion. And as long as you're having fun and you're just doing something that hasn't been done before, that's how you're doing a great job of just experimenting, really just putting yourself out there.
Yeah. Oh, you can turn it on.
Oh.
Yeah, there you go. You can leave all the
Well, Caroline just said it pretty well, so I don't know if I really have anything useful to add. But I do have problems with labels in general. So I do have a problem with the term experimental film when it becomes a genre, and now a certain approach to aesthetics, meets, it doesn't quite fit into the narrative sort of logic or the documentary idea of nonfiction, analysis, experiment. And I have a problem with that because there's nothing experimental about it. For me, experimental film is one where the artist is actually experimenting with the medium as opposed to trying to fit an aesthetic kind of give it, that. So, I was told when I first got into filmmaking, a great Indian filmmaker called Mani Kaul told me that remember to invent a new film each time you make a movie. And it doesn't matter, even if I'm making a narrative film or a documentary, as long as I'm inventing a film that I've never made and using devices that I have never ever used or thought about that fit that particular film. At a personal level, that's an experimental film, I'm experimenting with the medium.
Yeah.
I think for me, it's like the antithesis of like the 3-act structure is freedom, it's emotional based. It's to me like I'm a painter as well, and if you look at like abstract art compared to like a painting of, a photorealistic painting, it's kind of comparing those two where like abstract art is experimental art. It can be like playing with the camera, using different editing techniques. You don't necessarily have to tell a story, but you can tell a story through images. To me, experimental films is kind of complete freedom and emotional based.
I guess the only thing I would add to all that is kind of going on what it all said. I think that trying to pin it down or define it along the lines of certain qualities is kind of a dead end, because the point is that its qualities are limitless and the idea is to discover new ones. I think that the thing that makes it what it is more about the production context of where it comes from and the environment in which it is made, which is mainly that it's not a commercial environment. Generally speaking, these films are distributed out through the usual channels and in which films are shown. The crews are usually much smaller. They might even literally be I think almost every, if not every film in our show, the artist themselves is the person who made it and did everything. There may be a few collaborators. The funding is limited, if non-existent. And if there is funding, it's probably coming from sources that are particularly for that type of filmmaking rather than any type of business venture looking for profit. So I think that's probably an important fact of it, and in its history, just that it serves as like an alternative. It's an alternative to the mainstream, it's an alternative to the commercial sphere, and it exists as like a counter history to the film history that we're familiar with and that we are exposed to the vast majority of the time.
Yeah, it's both a counter history. Maybe we should turn off microphones, sorry. We're doing a tech check live, I suppose. A counter history, but also a challenge in a way. Just as oil painting was to the 15th century Florentine masters, filmmaking is the medium of our time, the 20th and 21st century, narrative filmmaking in particular. And in a moment when there are so many conversations happening about how studios are pushing to flatten filmmaking or standardize the form, experimental filmmakers are challenging that in such radical ways, whether it be on an emotional level, on a formal level. And you can see on an editing level, this amazing work by Jennifer Proctor, One Door Closes, which is appropriating film from already existent narrative films and making something new out of it. So it's also, it's a counter narrative, but it's also a challenge in a way, I would say.
Yeah, so it's interesting that you bring the analogy to Florentine painter that paints in a perfect sort of perspective and is absolutely sort of photorealistic to the subject. And then the abstract expressionists come in, in the 20th century, and then so that is the experimental form, the abstract expressionists to the Florentine painters of the 16th and 17th century. I would argue that even the Florentine painter, even when perspective was invented, that was an experiment, because before that perspective was flat. So somebody, broke that sort of trope and decided to look at perspective in a different way. But now that sort of gets amalgamated into the mainstream, and then, that's how it moves on. And my problem is that now that we have this history with experimental cinema, it has become a trope. That, if your film is abstract, it's experimental. But you're not really experimenting at all, because that's been done, before. And if that sort of,
I'm interested too in this idea of experimental filmmaking kind of existing in two worlds. We're sitting in an art museum right now, and the work at once is responsive and integrated with popular narrative cinema, but it's also very much responsive to painting, and it's movement-based and it's sound-based in many ways. And so what does it mean to have experimental film in an art museum? And what is that experience like as opposed to a theater, and when you're doing open projector night? Anyone? I'm talking to everybody.
I would say to that when we were going through the submissions and really trying to think about which ones we want to select it, when we do it for a regular non-museum open show, we are thinking about the context in which it's shown, and then we're thinking about the lineup itself and how they're going to fit together. For this, it wasn't any different, but we had to totally shift the context into something that we hadn't done before. And not only were we looking at, well, do we think this is interesting or beautiful or stimulating? We were like, well, is it going to work though in a gallery? Is it going to work in a context in which it is played on a loop? Someone can walk in, check it out, walk away. Someone can maybe stand there but walk around the space and look at the screen from different angles. You know what I mean? Like the actual interaction with the object itself on the screen or on a wall upstairs was something that we took into account, we thought about. And there were definitely films that we loved that we would have shown in a normal, say, OPM, but we're like, it doesn't quite maybe fit for what we're trying to do in the environment we know this is going to play in. And I think a number of works that are in the show, including, I would say, Anul's film, really kind of function so well in that environment because of the way that they kind of like activate the space and kind of take advantage, I think, of that room you're in, and the way that the film kind of, a lot of them kind of deal with duration and kind of ask you to sit there, and there's some of them have a meditative quality. I think Anul's kind of has that in some ways. So thinking about how the viewer, the museum attendee, is going to be like engaging or interfacing with it was something we thought about, and sometimes it was ineffable though. Sometimes it was hard to pin down, Sometimes it was just like, yeah, this is going to work on a wall, looped, And then sometimes it was more clear because maybe it had more of a narrative component, or it had a component that maybe would have functioned better if you would have like, well, you should probably see this from the beginning and into the end, which is not necessarily going to be the case if you're wandering around upstairs and you walk into it.
I mean, you said it really right, but yeah, I was talking about space activation. That's exactly what I was thinking about putting the show together. And there's been so many times when we've had submissions to open projector night. I would look at Spencer like, this would be great for a gallery setting, better for a museum. But we didn't even have this going yet, So when this popped up, it was a perfect opportunity to say, like, these are going to work great in a gallery setting compared to like in a theater. So when we're doing like regular open projector night, you're taking into consideration of sound, like playing a lot of narrative film with strong dialogue. If we play the film in here with strong dialogue, we're really able to hear it as well. So it's kind of keeping in mind of, what is experimental film, what is like an art museum film, and just, being mindful of the space activation, but also everyone's experience with it.
Yeah, kind of going off of that, what you guys were saying about activating the space. I remember when I made this film, it was about exactly a year ago now, and it was for a time-based studio class, and my professor was asking me, how do you see this, presented? Do you see this on, a monitor? Do you see this on, a projection screen? Do you see this on like a giant wall and stuff. And I remember he was telling me, he's like, you know, with years, like, I feel like you need it to be like super blown up and it'd be like so cool if you got it at some gallery. And then here we are 1 year later, a literal dream. So it's really for me about like what kind of makes it, what makes these films like art versus like what am I just like subscribing to on Netflix? Like, is it just going to be like the same thing like over and over again? And like with experimental film being in a museum setting versus like a wealthy street theater, any kind of movie theater for that instance. I think for me it's really about having the relationship, you know, activating the space and activating in a way that it challenges and forces the viewer to really think and respond to what they're seeing versus, you know, like you can watch a movie casually with your family and friends and, you know, not think much about it and think twice, but, you know, if you're in an art museum, you know, that's really forcing you like, oh, I should really be thinking about this, like, what am I seeing, like, what is happening in this film, what is this saying, what are the underlying themes of it, you know, like, people traditionally do with more traditional gallery setting art, like paintings or sculpture, you know, like, what am I looking at, what does this mean? I think with having experimental films with this wonderful exhibition, being at the Grand Rapids Art Museum, it's really kind of activating that relationship that kind of imposes between the filmmaker and the audience, and really kind of honing in on that relationship and thinking about what film is and what makes it art.
So the little experiment I did with myself as I was watching the program upstairs a few minutes ago was I was engaging with the films, but I was also trying to be mindful of my breathing along with the films, and it was really fascinating how you built this program with all, I mean, there's such fine curating going on there in terms of that arc that takes the viewer through emotionally, you know, with your film, other films that sort of allow you to breathe more, and it's, yeah, so it's a fabulous experience for me in that setting, just to watch the program, the way it's sequenced. Very much like an editor. I'm so curious, like, so how many people are film practitioners of some kind in the audience today? A lot of you, so yeah.
Do we have any do we have any of the artists in the exhibition here today? I thought I saw a few. I agree with you so much about the rhythm of the curating that Nick and Spencer have accomplished. And I will say, you know, we decided to split it into two series because in some sense, you know, we want people to come back again and experience these things as a set. Each is about 45 minutes long, which seems like a reasonable amount of time to sit in the gallery. And though there are two very different series of films that Graham will be playing, there are some themes that came out that you've identified that seem to be of interest to experimental filmmakers today. I'd say one perhaps, certainly like this amazing film by Joni Wynn, experiments in editing that are things that I've just never seen before, that are totally blowing past the parameters of what I think of as the medium. Or the gesture is a big part of it. Can you talk a little bit about how your approach to film, your approach to curating these specific works and the themes that you were trying to draw out?
I mean, my approach to film curation that I've been doing for a long time, especially with open projector night, I'm sure Spencer can relate to this, but I always kind of compare open projector night programming and curation kind of like a mixtape of cinema. You know, like if you're handing your friend a music tape, you want to make sure that it has kind of this rhythm to it. You can't just open track one with an extremely heavy metal song and the whole thing is just done with heavy metal. You just kind of have it be all over the place, you know?
You would do that.
I would do that as a metalhead, but you know, for my friends, you know, yeah, you're still right. But for a wider audience, to make sure that people are creative emotion is what I try to accomplish with curation. So if you watch program 1 and 2, there's some of the filmmakers in the audience, Darius right here, Darius Quinn, then we have Caroline. Her film is really colorful and bright and like it's emotional that goes into Darius's and it's black and white. So you're going from this really stark color contrast to black and white, and after that it goes into this animation. So this movement, for me, at least I think we've talked about this, is kind of really carrying the audience through these films without being like force-feeding them. You're not getting punched in the face with like really extreme emotions, and then we end on a really intense one. It's kind of like I said earlier, like experimental film to me is like the antithesis of the 3-act structure, but with curation, we're kind of creating the 3-act structure with how you watch it.
Yeah. I mean, when we were going through the selections, we, because we didn't know exactly what we were going to have with so many, we were just trying to be open-minded and just try to really meet each film on its own terms and what it was trying to do. But as the long list became the shorter list, and the short list became, okay, we have to make some choices, then these ideas started to emerge about like, well, do we want to lean into these kind of like maybe more personal autobiographical kind of films? Do we want to go more on the side of these abstract kind of maybe even psychedelic things? And I think as we were kind of going along, it's funny to actually talk about it because like Nick and I have been doing this for so long, we have this kind of language that we both understand in terms of what we respond to. I mean, usually we're in the same room sitting there watching these things, and sometimes I'm sitting there watching it and I'm like, I know how I feel about this, and I probably know exactly how Nick is feeling about this right now. And then we'll look at each other. But once we had decided, like, okay, these are the ones, the actual order of the show, we treated it just as, with as much kind of attention as we do a open show that we do in a theater. Because, I mean, personally, I've been to a lot of short film programs where you sit down and watch them, and the order of the films matters. And depending on how long it is and what the ebb and flow of that kind of rhythm is, it definitely matters. And so we tried as best we could to kind of order it in such a way that where there was a lot of variety, so that we wouldn't have, kind of similar films right next to each other, so there would be kind of a real like modulation throughout the program. But then also that kind of Nick mentioned in a couple examples that there would be these little like details or aspects that would kind of connect them, that would kind of link them to each other. And even down to the fact that one of the films you mentioned earlier, Jen Proctor's, which is like the supercut of The Doors, putting that one last just kind of made sense because you have all these doors closing, but then it's a looped program and it goes back to the beginning and there's a bunch of doors opening in the film as well, so we're like, perfect. This is it. So some of them like that, even just they fell right into place. It was easy in some instances.
Yeah, amazing. I'm curious about practice, your practice in particular, our filmmakers. We often think of filmmaking as a very collaborative act. I wonder how you approach it if you do have a lot of collaborators, what it's like working with collaborators, since both of your filmmaking practices and your art making practices have such specific vision. What is that experience like, either working with others? Do you work with a lot of people to make this happen and translate your ideas to others, and they're bringing in their ideas of their own, or is it more of a solitary act for you?
Well, if I'm really starting, if you know me personally in my art making practice, you definitely know that I do pretty much everything all by myself. I love collaborating. Anytime I get the opportunity to do that, collaboration is such a beautiful thing that can happen, especially in art making and film. But with this film, it's a film by Carolyn Bell. I pretty much just did it all. I know there's a little bit of help with someone who helped me film the black and white footage, but I didn't necessarily give them credits because it was who the person who helped me with the black and white footage is who the film was about. And I remember him telling me oh, you are never going to have a voice in the film or photo industry you like speak up and talk about this like these experiences that you have, you know, I will make sure that you never have a voice. And so like this time, like a year ago, I was like, I just have a lot on my mind, I just need to get this out. And so I started putting together this kind of cohesive kind of body of work I'm still working on that explores identity in the face of trauma, and how, you know, you can like hold memories, and you know, that's really what my film is about, like holding on to these memories. And even though like with the black and white footage in my film, I made sure that it was black and white to make sure that I can reflect on what has happened, and that was in the past. Whereas with the red footage of myself that I superimposed over it as like a multi-layer technique, I wanted that to kind of show, like, especially with the red vibrant color, just to show that, you know, like, these memories are still very active and alive in me today, and, you know, they still affect me, like, in my day-to-day life. So I wanted, like, this film just to be, you know, I have all this archive footage that was shot when I was 19, and just figuring out who I was, and then with this red footage I like overlaid, and that was also shot in an old bathroom from a house I used to live in. So I really just kind of did it myself, and I remember telling people like, well, I had this idea for this film, and it's kind of like an autobiographical, but it's experimental, and there's going to be a narration through it, and no one really knew what I was talking about, so just put it together, and it came out, and it's great. And yeah, but yeah, with collaboration, I love doing that, but with a lot of my own art making and filmmaking process, it's usually me doing the bulk of it, and then reaching out to people after, you know, I get the majority of it done, like, can you help me finish this? What more do I need? And just kind of asking for just like constructive feedbacks and critiques. That's one of the most important things that you can do as an artist, is asking for that feedback to get better, and, you know. That's such like a hard thing that I think a lot of people don't really understand, is that once you get constructive feedback, that's the best thing you can get, and you can only get better from there.
I think it's also out of sheer practical reasons, but I do make my films alone, so I do all the shooting, the editing, the sound, recording, as well as sound editing, and just the whole thing. That's just how it's been. I think mostly because I make films with very little money. So I usually just don't have money to even hire an assistant to help me with equipment, you know, like carrying it in these remote places and all that. But and now it's sort of become my way of getting into a headspace where I'm alone with my subject, and I'm immersed in it, and having that dialogue with somebody else at this point feels like it would be a distraction, because I just, that's become my process. But I think serendipitously, if, you know, a kind of collaboration happens, I'm not opposed to it at all. I mean, I did make a film in 2017 where I recorded all this music for the film, and then it was in the film, but I needed to get a really good sound mix, and I don't have the technical capabilities of it, so I hired one of the finest sort of sound artists in the country, and guess what? I mean, he said, this is where I did my PhD at Harvard on this music, and, you know, like, this was the material I worked with, and he just like knew this music inside out. It was amazing. So, I mean, and he brought that kind of to the film, which I could have never done.
To that end too, I'm really curious about Amal and Spencer. Both of you are professors. And what is that relationship like when you're teaching, you know, green students about experimental film? You're asking them to get on board with something maybe they've never experienced before, and what's more, you're asking them to make something that's maybe never been made before, challenging things that have been made in their own unique way. What is that relationship like? I'm going to imagine it's one where you, of course, are giving wisdom, but it's a cybernetic relationship where you get wisdom back, and that must impact your own practice. So I'm curious what teaching young filmmakers does for you, and how that works in your life.
I'm going to tell the story exactly the secret. I don't even know if I should say it, but anyway, I was scheduled to teach the experimental film class this coming winter semester, and then I told Spencer the other day that you are a better person to teach that course than I am, so please, do you mind teaching it? And Spencer said, yes, I'll be happy to teach it. So I do think that Spencer is a better person. I do also teach a simultaneous class out from the video art, which is the production version of the experimental class, and I can talk about teaching the kind of production aspect of it, but really the history, theory, criticism, and all that. He's the man.
Thank you and all. Yeah, it's interesting. So the class that I'm all talking about, it's sort of a history of experimental film. I have taught that before, but I also teach an intro course almost every semester where I include experimental film in it because they need to be exposed to this. They need to kind of open their minds up a little bit to this stuff and understand that, like I said earlier, there's a whole other history of this stuff that's existed basically since movies were invented. But not a lot of people know about it or hear about it as much. So I'm trying to, change their conception of movies a little bit. But I would say one of the things that has really surprised me, or I'm constantly just excited and inspired by, is the fact that over the years that I've been teaching this stuff, a lot of experimental or avant-garde film, I feel like, comes with these connotations that it's really difficult and challenging, or that you have to have a level of intellectual rigor or sophistication or education to understand it. And a lot of people kind of maybe encounter it with a lot of this baggage. And I always try to tell my students, just forget all that. Just anything, try not to immediately confront yourself with the question of, do I get it or not? Do I understand it? Does that mean I'm not smart enough? And I'm just just meet the film on its own terms and think about what it does to you. And sometimes it's literally what does it literally do to your eyeballs? If it's something that's more abstract or psychedelic, what does it do as a perception experience or something? The thing that, again, going back to what I said, that excites me and kind of inspires me is how much I've seen them totally embrace this stuff. There are plenty of them who encounter some of these films, and they do find it frustrating or challenging, but at the same time, they encounter some of this stuff and they love it. And I think that there is just this kind of, most of my students are 18, 19, 20 years old, and I think there is an excitement in them to see something different, partially because I think of kind of what Terra, you alluded to earlier, the kind of marketplace and landscape of movies right now, at least mainstream movies, and how much people want alternatives and want something different and want something fresh. And I think there's a little bit of a desire there that this helps them it feeds it a little bit. And I also think that there's an element of the way that so much experimental film is using really non-traditional techniques or exploring different ideas. Sometimes people can find that frustrating because it's not necessarily in the sphere of conventional filmmaking, but I think that I don't want to generalize too much, but I think a lot of young people are experiencing visual culture outside of the movie theater. They're experiencing it. I bring this up to my students and I kind of chuckle, but it's so true. TikTok is changing the language of visual culture, and because people, especially younger people, are making things for it, they're thinking about editing and framing and putting music to something in a different way than they have in the past, or at least even a lot of people have been taught in film schools in the past. And so I think that being exposed to that stuff, scrolling endlessly on your phone, is priming you to watch an experimental film and be like, oh, this isn't even that weird actually. Because I've seen some weird shit on TikTok. This actually isn't that strange. Whether it's the content or the form. So that's really cool to see in students. And sometimes they're the ones who are really resistant, I don't know. And sometimes I kind of have to bring them in a little bit. But it also depends on the film, of course. But yeah, it's interesting, semester after semester.
Something you said about the active viewing that Caroline was talking about and the multitude of interpretation reminded me of this great cartoon that the painter Everhart made in 1946, where he's trying to teach how to look at what was a relatively new form of abstract painting. And there's a guy, and he's standing there, and he's got his fedora on and his tie and his suit coat, and he's looking at a painting of just lines and blobs, and he's laughing, and he points and says, "Ha, what does it represent?" And the painting in the next panel shouts back, "What do you represent? You're a space too, sir." And so there is something to the ambiguity and the strangeness that experimental film, and particularly young people in experimental film, bring to it, that there is a more active viewership in a way. It's not predetermined. You have to figure it out for yourself. You're figuring out what the director is saying, but also what does it mean when your particular embodied reaction happens, and what does that say about you?
Yeah, I would just to jump on that, I would say real quick that one thing I do tell my students is, I think a lot of film experiences, maybe more narrative ones, are almost treated as like the film like gives it to you. It like hands it to you, steps away, and you have it. Experimental film is like a handshake with it. You have to like reach out, and you have to actually kind of embrace it in a certain way. If I think you want to have like an honest experience with it, it's a different dynamic. And I try to emphasize that even the act of engaging with it kind of has maybe something that you never practiced before, but that there is a little bit more of a, you have to give yourself a little more to it sometimes.
Yeah, kind of chime in on that too, and I think one of my favorite things about experimental film is, and what I want people to take away from this, is patience. Spencer's talking a lot about TikTok and people scrolling through their phones, and I really don't think a lot of the younger generation, including myself, has the patience anymore just to sit in a gallery and just watch these films, experimental films for 45 minutes, like really challenge yourself. And that's when we're going through all these films and watching them, there's ones that you have to really sit with and be patient and see how it develops and see what happens with it. And I think that is literally one of my favorite things about experimental cinema, is learning patience. So.
I wanted to leave some time for questions from the audience if we had any, but I have one last question. And as I alluded to in this introduction, Nick, for me, is one of the great Grand Rapids community builders, in that since I lived in Grand Rapids about a decade ago, and then came back and he was still doing it. And both of you alluded to the fact that this type of filmmaking can be so solitary, yet we've found such a profound community through the Open Projector Night series in particular. And I was wondering if you wouldn't mind just leaving us on a few words about the community that everyone here is fostering and creating. I mean, you as a locus in a way, but also all of the institutions that are involved, Grand Valley, Wealthy Theater, and all of these other little spider webs that have gone out and brought together so many different connections. I wondered if you would just leave us on a few words about the community of filmmaking in Michigan.
Before I came on the stage, I was headed this way. I had like this mental confliction of being like, I have imposter syndrome to the fullest. And it's something I deal with all the time. And thank you for those extreme kind words. But for me, building, this is not all me. I could not do this without this community. I could not do this without Spencer. I could not do this without trust and support. And I can't do it without filmmakers. So technically, I'm just a person that loves film. I love filmmaking. And like I said in the beginning of this conversation, when I was in film school, the community didn't have anywhere to play their films. And I knew I wanted that, and I knew that I wanted to provide that experience. I come from a background in my early teens of the skateboard community, the punk rock community, metalhead, all that kind of stuff. And it's a very niche crowd that's really tight. And I know that for a fact, it really puts something in me to say that I want to continue to build a community. When I went to the skate park as a kid, and I was skateboarding with all these skateboarders who were outcasts, made fun of in high school, whatever, we didn't fit the mold of what it is to be accepted out here. So we stuck together as skateboarders, the same thing as punk rockers. And I feel like filmmakers and artists are kind of the same, we're outside of the mold of what it's supposed to be. hip and cool and accepted and dressed a certain way or listen to certain music. And I knew that I just wanted to continue to mold that community and be with people that are like me. And it's every day I wake up, I ask myself, well, how can I make the community better? How can I make people better? How can I make myself better? Through the power of cinema, and that's community. So, and again, it's not all me. So thank you, Spencer, thank you guys, and thank all the filmmakers that continue to support.
Amen. Questions from the audience, if there are any. Feel free to shout them out.
If I can speak loudly enough. So I came and saw the show with a couple. Oh, perfect. Awesome. So I came and saw the show with a couple, a little bit older generation, maybe hasn't watched a lot of experimental film. And after they brought up, it would be nice if there was an artist statement to kind of explain the film. And so this is something you were talking about earlier a little bit. So I'm curious, because initially I was like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Maybe that would be helpful for people who maybe don't know how to experience these films or how to react, and maybe help with a discussion afterwards. But I'm just curious, if that's something, how each of you kind of feels about that idea. Because I've been to, painting exhibits where there are artist statements, and that's something that you find in certain spaces like this. But I guess as artists, how do you feel about, creating an artist statement? Because that's something maybe that is forced upon us in like school settings, and then as curators as well.
So for me, with artist statements, I love writing a good artist statement. They're great. I love it. I think artist statements, especially with experimental film, that is a very good point that you bring up. Like, if we had maybe like a little pamphlet or something that had maybe artist statements in it, that might be useful, especially for audience members that aren't used to experiencing experimental film. And I myself do have a few paragraph artist statement about my piece. And whenever I talk about my film, I try to incorporate elements from my artist statements, into it. But like we were kind of talking about earlier, while an artist statement is incredibly useful and can help explain and kind of dissect what an art piece or film is, at the same time it's really great with this exhibition because, it's all experimental, the artist statement is kind of what the audience takes away from it. So, sometimes you don't really need an artist statement, while it is very useful at times. Sometimes the real artist statement is just kind of the feelings, the amount of reflection you can get from experiencing these films, and just the actual act of just experiencing it kind of as this meditative act, especially in elder space.
So I know yours is a question, but I think you make a really good point, and that I do see the value in some sort of lens through which the audience engages with the work. I think for a casual sort of museum visitor who just chances upon the exhibition, some kind of a programming statement would have helped. But on the other hand, I really sort of hear Spencer, I think he said something to the effect, or what you tell students in your class about just having that surrender to those films without preconceived sort of ideas about what, and allow open-mindedly those films to kind of do their thing. I see greater value in not having that, particularly the artist's statement, because artists are egotistical. They put way too much language in their work, sometimes, and that makes it actually more opaque, the work. And I think there's value in bringing one's own experience to the work and then drawing the value that the work has to offer.
I would say that when we were going through all the selections, a lot of them, the service that we use, Film Freeway, they get submitted, a lot of people do include an artist statement. We would never look at them ahead of time. We would just pull the film up and we would just watch it because we didn't want to add anything going in. All we wanted to know was the title and maybe the name of the artist and whatever else they decided to put in the credits, which a lot of experimental films don't even have credits or have minimal ones. And it has to do with exactly what you're saying. I mean, we really just wanted to try and experience this so fresh and like I knew. Sometimes we finish it and we'd be like, what does the artist statement say about this one? And we scroll down, we look at it, and okay, maybe we watch it again, or watch parts of it again. It can help. I feel like for me, curating this, but also in general, just as a fan and as someone who likes to watch this stuff, I see it as a tool. And a tool has its uses, but it also has its limits. And part of the limit is that like any artist's intentions, it only matters so much. Because you are watching the thing or reading the thing or experiencing the art and it's yours too when you experience it and you are there to fill in the gaps that the artist creates for you. So I think it can inform your experience and it can really be a tool, but at the same time, yes, it can be very, it can be too much or it can be obscurant and it can be trying to participate in this like discourse that doesn't really help the art. But it can also just be a kind of way of assisting in the experience, I would say.
Yeah, I actually, this past Saturday, I put on an art show, and I was really debating on if I should have an artist statement or not. And I decided against it, because I wanted people to look at the paintings and walk away with their own interpretation. Now, when it came to like this show, and curating it and having an artist statement, I almost feel irresponsible speaking on behalf of someone else's art. I didn't make the film, I can watch it, I can create my own interpretation. But I'd rather have every viewer that walks into that room have their own idea of what the film is, rather than me tell them what I have an idea of what it is. So, yeah.
I also love the idea of like, they maybe go upstairs and watch some of them, and then if they want the artist statement, they want to know more, they just look up the artist. And they go and find their other work or their website or wherever else too, So that's maybe a cool side effect of it.
I think we have time for maybe one more question. I want to make sure, we'll make it two more questions so that folks can get in. You first, I think the microphone might be close by. Or whoever Elena gets to first. Because we definitely want everyone to have some time to watch some of these.
Okay, so speaking of curation, I'm fascinated by the group of films. I haven't seen them all, but I'm interested how you curated. Was it a call or was it invitational, and did you have like a lot? I enjoy hearing how you sat and watched the films together and wondered like how did you come to know which films would be in, especially because there wasn't an artist statement, which I think is great too. Just like, was it like a gut feeling? Was it like, did you feel a theme? I'm wondering that because of experimental film, how it came about, how you curated it.
So first and foremost, yeah, so every show that we do for Open Projector Night, and this show specifically, we have a platform called Film Freeway, and we encourage filmmakers to submit through that, but we have guidelines. Number one, it has to be connected to the state of Michigan, either through content, location, or group. So if you submit and you say you're not connected to Michigan, you can delete out, unfortunately. This one specifically, the film could not be longer than 10 minutes. So like I said earlier, we got over like 113 submissions. Some of them were a little longer, so we cut it. When it comes down to like watching it, me and Spencer graduated together. We've been friends for a long time. We went to film school together, and just I think we have an understanding and just like this unspoken language. And it's not like we know what is good. Like we can't define what is good. We know what is good for ourselves. We know what we like. We look for certain things, and if it speaks to us, like I said, we'll finish a film and like look at each other like, yeah, that's it. There's other times we watch something, we're like, that's definitely not it. But we're always trying to be very encouraging to any filmmaker that submits. So there's a lot of times if someone, they don't get into the festival, they'll write like, hey, can you provide any feedback, blah, blah. And I always do my best to like really nurture that filmmaker to make sure that they feel heard, to make sure they feel respected, and most importantly, to feel inspired to continue to create. Because, yeah, not everyone gets in. We want to put everyone in, but it's not likely.
And we have one more question over here.
Yes. I'm wondering what when you all watch an experimental film, you have reactions that are maybe just more surface and more instant, and then as you sit with it longer, you start to have other thoughts and reactions. And I sometimes wonder when I'm watching something how much I should try to push myself beyond whatever I judge to be a surface or initial reaction, and how much to just lean into whatever happens in my head and my heart. How much I should try to stretch myself and say, okay, this is spiders, and I have a visceral reaction to spiders, but I'm going to push, or women objectifying themselves, I might just not be open to that at all. But what do you all experience? Do you push yourself beyond those initial reactions, or do you try to just let whatever happens to you happen?
I think as a curator.
Good question.
Yeah, I think it is, I don't want to speak for Spencer, but I think it's our full responsibility to watch everything, anything. Even if you feel triggered by something, we need to watch it. Because, I don't think it'd be very respectful of a filmmaker to say, well, I'm triggered by spiders, so therefore I'm not going to watch your film. Or therefore I'm triggered by A, B, C, and D, I'm not going to watch your film. I will say that when, normal open projector nights, I find myself like at home watching a lot of submissions, and if I find myself getting tired or burnt out, I'm done. I'm done for the day, because I go on to the next film that's not fair to that filmmaker. I want to make sure I give them my full attention and my full respect. And like you said, it's like, sometimes you can be watching it and just, I don't know where to go from there. All I know is that, I just want to make sure I'm respecting the filmmaker, and I watch each film, but if I get tired, I want to make sure that they're getting respect. But, any words on that?
I would just say that, watching it as a lens of like curating a show, and then watching it if I were to come here as a guest is kind of different. Like what you're describing is a little bit maybe different. I think trying to really be like, take the submission for what it is and be kind of generous to it, especially because they took the time to kind of submit it and really be, like, it's our responsibility to curate the thing. When I'm not curating something or I'm outside of that, I would say I try to do that the best I can, because I think that because a lot of this stuff can be challenging and have these kind of there's some barriers to get into it, trying to be as like generous to it as I can is something I try to practice. Sometimes it's hard though, because of what you're saying, for whatever reason. And sometimes it literally comes down to like your own taste, your preferences, or what you maybe are into with filmmaking. But I would say that I think that, back to your question, like initial responses to something, even though they might feel kind of spontaneous and visceral, I think they do have like deep roots, in your experience of it. And so I feel like for me, I try to take the time to examine those or think about them after the fact and not try to, dismiss them or write them off. I also find that in general, especially with experimental work, talking with other people about it is big. And I think especially like with a show like this, being in a gallery setting, if you're with people or even if you're not, maybe you turn the corner and there's a stranger and they were like, did you see that? It's like sharing other people's experiences and getting their perspective can really be informative, especially with an experimental work where maybe you don't have that avenue into it and it can be difficult, but then you speak to someone else and you're like, you just made it seem so easy to get into that film through that particular route, But I'm curious what you two have to say about that question.
Personally, the more challenging, the better for me, because it really pushes me and it makes me aware of what my limits tolerance are, so it's a check. And I have to expand that, to really truly be open to see what the filmmaker is doing. I mean, in a program like this, I would expect that any film, that's been put in isn't just outright objectifying. I mean, it's very careful programming as opposed to careless, irresponsible kind of programming. So, but I really hear. I'm so glad for your question because I think it sort of goes. I think we come full circle to the first question about what experimental cinema is, and I think it is this kind of cinema that makes one aware of one's own thoughts, one's own levels of acceptance or not, and as opposed to this complete sort of mindless engagement with the screen and the story. And I think the fact that it pushes us to think and engage and question and even hate perhaps that work. I mean, outright reject it. I think it is experimental cinema doing its best job, which is to not necessarily provoke, but to provoke thought and self-awareness of some kind.
Yeah, absolutely. You said it perfectly. With my experience as an artist and filmmaker, for me, what you brought up of, like with these triggering concepts and stuff, like, well, do I want to watch this? Nick and Spencer were just saying, like, even if like ABCD does trigger the viewer, you're still sitting there and watching it. And for me, with my film, that's was all about my filmmaking process. For me, I know that if I'm doing something that I'm comfortable doing and have done before, then I'm not going to be happy with the end result because it's something I'm comfortable doing. And, if I'm doing something like this experimental filmmaking process that, is, you learn kind of as you go because it's all experimental. And then with the topics that, my piece covers, it's extremely vulnerable and, putting yourself in this extremely uncomfortable position with these uncomfortable topics that, can bring up all sorts of memories and experiences, whether it's the artist or the viewer, it's, at least with my piece, I try to destigmatize kind of talking about that kind of stuff. And, I think that's what kind of strengthens it is just once you can talk about your films, that really opens up gateways with other artists, your community, and everything. So, it's really once you're uncomfortable, at least with my experience, that's how you're really building and growing more. Because if you're doing the same thing that you're just comfortable with, you're not going to grow as a person or artist. You have to challenge yourself and just push those boundaries that you might not even yourself know that you can do. So once you can get past that wall of kind of self-doubt and, well, I don't really know how to do this, so I'm going to limit myself. Or, oh, I don't really know enough about this topic, so I'm not going to talk about it or ask a bunch of questions. But once you open that kind of gateway, experimental film is yours, and you can make it anything you want it to.
Bravo, bravo. What a great note to end on. I think the call to push ourselves beyond is an urgent one. We need everybody in the world to ask themselves hard questions, and the questions challenging us today, and what better way to do that through experimental film, and also supporting experimental filmmakers is so important in the world that we live in. It's so clearly a labor of love and a vibrant one in this community. So now that we're wrapping up this talk, please go upstairs, watch series 1 of this film, and then come back after November 26th, see the second set. Please also keep an eye on the Open Projector Night, which I think every 4 times a year? 4 times a year, that Nick and Spencer are putting all of this together. And thank you so much for coming. Please give it up for our amazing panelists.